And just confirm before we start, we're live?
Yes.
Wonderful. Good evening, everyone. My name is Councillor Paul Follows, Leader of the Council and Chair of this meeting of the Executive. The meeting is being held in the Council Chamber at the Berries in Godalming and is being webcast live. The agenda was published on Monday, the 23rd of June, 2025, and a supplementary agenda pack was subsequently published on Monday, the 30th of June, 2025. A few housekeeping matters before we kick off from me. It is very hot today, and it is only slightly cooler in this room than it is outside or indeed the rest of the building. If anybody at any time needs water, and I'm saying members of the council, members of the public, officers in the room, if at any time you need water, there is more over there and it will be restocked during the evening. So please just go up and get it. Don't worry about disturbing anybody. Just do what you need to do. It's a long night. We've got a lot of talking and the room is quite full. It will not stay even this cool for very long, I suspect. Before we kick off, though, I'm just going to give a little bit of an advisory as to how I'm intending to run this meeting, because, of course, it could at various points get quite fraught or quite complicated if we don't bring some structure to it. As the papers stand on the agenda, there are 21 items on the agenda tonight at this meeting, and it can only run till a maximum of 10 o'clock. I have therefore, in advance of this meeting, asked Democratic Services to put a reserve date in the diary next week for any business not covered this evening, and to ensure that we give the primary item, and I think actually I'll be more accurate in saying primary items, plural, on the agenda tonight, particularly the still item in the public interest. Item 8 will take the time that it requires, but we will not rush to end it to get to other business. Now, that being said, there are a handful of other items that we do need to cover tonight, because if we don't, there are other issues in terms of timing or legal and compliance obligations for the council, and I'll outline what they are. But all of the public questions, all of the members, the single members question, the vast majority of the registered speakers on items of the agenda, and of course the still item itself, are all related to item 8. And I will be amalgamating those into a structure which I'll explain when we get to item 8, so that we can maximise engagement with the public, so we can maximise the views that are heard, so we can have a discussion about the ONS recommendations, and so we can deal with the substance of the report properly and faithfully to the subject matter and to those who are concerned about it. As I've said, the maximum time for this meeting can go on to tonight is 10 p.m. So we will be covering the still discretionary review item 8 and all of the associated items first, followed by item 9, the grounds maintenance contract. We will then address, as I mentioned, a handful of other urgent items that do need to be addressed, and those are items 13, 14, 16 and 17. Now, if we do, for some magical reason, have a lot of time left by the time we have done all those 6 items, I will take any of the other items that we had on the agenda in an order we've determined in advance, but it is my assumption that the bulk of the business will go to the reserve date to be held next week. I will also call a short adjournment for a comfort break after item 8, so that we can all reset into what is more standard council business from item 9. So to go to the start of the agenda, item 1, Chris, can you advise any apologies for absence?
Thank you, Leader. Apologies this evening from Councillors Gemma Long and Kika Merrilees.
Thank you very much indeed. Item 2, the minutes. Can I please have your approval to agree the minutes of the meetings on the 6th and 13th of May and the 3rd of June? Can I have all those in favour, please show? Thank you very much, everyone. Declarations. Any executive members to state a declaration of interest on any matters on the agenda? Seeing none, I shall move then to item 6, as I will come back to questions from members of the public as part of item 8 in a moment. Do have a couple of minor announcements. I met with the Minister of State for MHCLG at MHCLG on the matter of LGR, that's Baroness Taylor, to discuss a number of issues regarding our ongoing business with local government reorganisation. This is really just at this point to highlight that the government consultation on the main matter is now open. It is a fairly bland and unengaging consultation from the government that requires quite a lot of technical knowledge to be able to do it properly. There have been numerous options put forward and guidance material issued by both Surrey and also the 9 districts and boroughs. Within Waverley and partly in Guildford, there will be some webinars for residents to engage, which over this part of the world I will chair, and Guildford will, Leader of Guildford will chair over there. The first one, Julia McShane and I are doing together, which is an online-only session on the evening of July the 3rd at 7 o'clock. Details will be circulated and press will be circulated. Within Waverley, there will be 4 in-person sessions, which will be myself, officers and other members from that locality. The first will be Hazelmere on the 14th of July, Farnham on the 16th of July, Godalming on the 22nd of July, and Cranley on the 29th of July. There will be an email to all members circulating those dates and times, and more importantly, the locations, which have definitely been agreed by officers, but I don't have in front of me. At that point, I will move to item 8, but before we begin item 8, I have a few other bits to say on this subject. This has been and remains a complex issue. Members of the executive have not been running round commenting or doing lots of social media or general media on the subject. We have not been outside protesting. We have not been making our point clear on this for one very simple reason, and that reason is not because we aren't interested or that we don't care. It's because we have to make a decision here tonight, and engaging in those activities would make us subject to predetermination and therefore not able to take part in this meeting and its decision-making at all. Now, I appreciate from the outside that may look callous. It may look like we lack compassion. It may even come across as robotic and technocratic. But the more we would express an opinion on this, the more we care about it, the more disbarred we would be from taking part in this session at all. You'll have noticed that Councillor Townsend and I attended the ONS session to observe. Many of you were also present, members of the public and members of the council. We wanted to hear not just the outcomes of that debate, but that debate in full. And I've asked Councillor Coburn, who was going to be present anyway, to register to speak on the matter. I've asked her if she will take questions, as she has agreed to do, on the recommendations from ONS, so that we can seek further clarity on those recommendations in this session. It is my intent here tonight to ensure that we discuss and debate this matter in a proper way, that we give due respect to our officers and ensure that all views on this are heard. We have seen a great deal of misinformation put into the public domain on this matter, opinions given by those who are not qualified to state so, and conflicting legal and technical opinions from different sources. And like many things in local government, this makes it a complicated task for any elected person to address, particularly those of us in responsibility to make lawful decisions. Now, it's my hope tonight that we will undertake our duties here as the exec in a fair, reasonable, proportionate and compassionate way, whilst also making sure that we act properly and lawfully as a local authority. We cannot simply pick and choose which legal and professional advice we want to hear, and we certainly can't, as has been suggested by people upwards and including the MP, that we simply ignore legislation that we don't like or find inconvenient. We have rules and standing orders for meetings of this council and of this type of meeting. This is an executive session. Now, as chair, I have a very wide latitude in how I handle the debate in the room. So I just wanted to let you know about how I'm intending to deal with that tonight. I'm going to take quite a relaxed attitude to it, to a point. Please can I ask that people try not to repeat points that have already been made, to give evidence or sources when making assertions where possible, and to, of course, show due respect to every person in this room, whether you agree with them or not. And that goes for officers, members of the public alike, particularly on a hot day when most of us have been here all day. That's going to be particularly challenging, I expect. Whilst I'm going to apply quite a lot of latitude to speaking times and engagement, if I sense officers being attacked, if I see deliberate misinformation being called, I will call that out. I will stop debates. I will stop the microphone. I will cut off things on the webcast. Those are all within my discretion. I don't expect to need or want to use any of those discretions, but I'm just flagging that I reserve that right if the debate takes a turn that is deeply inappropriate for this meeting. Now, in terms of how I intend to actually take the matters on SIL together, because as I mentioned at the beginning of the discussion, we've got questions from members of the public that are on SIL. We've got a single question from a member on SIL. We've got the ONS recommendations on SIL, and we've got the actual item of business itself on SIL. I'm amalgamating this together in the following order for as much clarity for everybody in this room as possible. Firstly, I will take the public questions and any supplemental questions that those members of the public wish to ask. And just to add, whilst there has been a written response on your original submitted question, we will try where possible to answer the supplementary or ask one of our officers to do that. But I can't guarantee that you will get an answer to that tonight, but you certainly will in writing if you're not given one. I will then take the single question from a member that has been submitted. That's from Councillor Peter Clark. Peter, once you've had your response to your question, I will also ask you if you have any supplementals, and same rules apply. At that point, I will be moving to a section on questions of clarity, which will be a set of questions from me and other members of the executive to the head of planning and other officers here on matters that I do believe need clarifying before the debate starts. And that's of broadly matters of fact, matters of interpretation, and other issues that have come up during this debate that I think it's relevant for all of us present here before we start actually having the substantive debate on this subject. At which point I will ask Councillor Townsend to move the paper and to introduce the paper for as long as she needs to do so. I have also waived any of the introductory time for the members of the exec because I think it needs to be done as holistically as the portfolio holder believes it needs to be. At that point, I will pause and go to Councillor Carol Coburn to discuss the ONS recommendations and to discuss how the executive committee wish to handle those recommendations, which bits we intend to adopt or change or modify, etc. And then I will go to the rest of the exec for the debate on the item, at which point we will reach a conclusion in the debate and either amendments or other changes will be made or there will be a vote on the substantive. And once we have done that and a vote has been taken and the matter concluded, I will adjourn for a comfort break. Can I just check with anybody in the room, and I'll just do this as a free session. Are there any questions as to how I'm intending to do this that are confusing or a problem? Councillor Martin.
Thank you, Leader. There was a question of also many of us have registered to speak and you didn't mention that point.
You're quite right, and my apologies. Once we move back to the main debate and before I bring the rest of the executive in, I will take the list of speakers as is listed here. On this one and only occasion, if there are members present who have not registered to speak on the item but wish to, I will hear them, okay? Because there are a few in the room who haven't registered. Just to be clear, the ones that have registered are Councillor Austin, Councillor Barker-Lomax, Councillor Coburn, Councillor Hosseini, Councillor Hyman, Councillor Martin and Councillor Ward. So if you're not one of those people but wish to speak anyway on this occasion, I will let you. And I will also say that Councillor Coburn, your time registered to speak is completely separate from any of the ONS questions, and that's obviously entirely your own time, as is the usual rules. Any further comments or questions as to how I'm going to take this? Now, I appreciate this could be quite a fraught debate. We all need to try and keep as cool in all sense of the words as possible. And at that point, I will move to the public questions. In terms of public questions, some of you have been here before, some of you haven't. If you would like to come down to the front, there is a station set up for you there. It's the large middle button. When it's live, the microphone will glow red. You will have the opportunity to read your question. I will then ask the portfolio holder to respond to your question, and I will then come back to you for any supplementary question following that. So to begin that session, I start with Helen Grant, who has a question.
I wanted to comment on the amount of work that the executive is putting in blocking the justice that everybody's seeking here. And I feel that the council needs to stop hiding behind the legislation, because there are many still charging authorities who either don't apply the levy to homeowners at all, or take a helpful and pragmatic stance by ignoring things like forms in wrong orders or missed commencement notices. And what this illustrates is that the whole situation here at Waverley has been caused by a culture, a nasty culture of cynically using a bad piece of legislation against its own residents for its own advantage. My question is to the Leader of the Council. As Leader of the Council, you have overseen this going on for 5 years now. So why did you not care to stop it? Or is it the case that, knowing your clearly stated opinion that you personally think homeowners should pay, that you actually agreed with this policy and perhaps even instigated it?
If I could just comment very briefly on a couple of those before I bring the portfolio holder in. My understanding was that the policy to charge homeowners SIL was brought in as part of the local plan and was therefore brought in by the previous administration of this council. There is a set of legislation that governs how that works. And when we get to the questions of clarity, I have a couple of questions of clarity for the head of planning, which will address some of those matters. In terms of doing something about it, The executive have a report now before them, which we commissioned requesting an outline for a discretionary review. At the moment, the executive can't be accused of blocking or in fact doing anything in either direction, because it's tonight that we're actually having that debate and making that decision. So that is where we are right now. Councillor Townsend, would you like to just comment on the stated answer before I come to a supplementary?
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Mrs. Grant, for your question. This council has to take decisions based on its officers' legal advice and also on its officers' advice and also on legal advice. We can't pick and choose which parts of the legislation that we choose to implement, and the council has to make its own decisions. We all have sovereignty as councils, and we have to come to our own decisions. Thank you.
Do you have a supplementary question, Mrs. Grant?
Well, I do, because we still haven't heard the answer as to why, although it was the previous administration that brought it in, this administration has been in charge of it and has failed to do the annual review that was part of this adopting the legislation. If that annual review had been carried out with any integrity, then it would have identified these problems years ago and done something about it, unless they didn't want to.
So we're going to come back to that one in writing, I think, because I think that's appropriate to do so. What I would say, though, is from my perspective, the first item that was raised to me on this matter was the matter from Mr. Daly, which went through and is going through the existing processes for review that have always been there. And that is what has been undertaken. And I had not, until Mr. Daly's case, been aware of any other cases. But again, there's a point on this that will be dealt with in the questions of clarity with the officer in a moment. Right. Next question is from Mr. Daly.
Mr. Chairman, may I ask your permission to skip my question and move directly to a supplementary question? And would you grant me just a couple of minutes to speak on behalf of victims of Sill and Waverley? Okay. Councillor Follows, you kindly gave me 10 minutes of your time last September, you've referred to it, where I explained how my wife and I were charged with 70,000 in Sill for replacing a home extension under 100 square metres that should have been automatically exempt. I didn't ask you whether Waverley could do this, but whether you felt it was morally right and just. If you remember, you stopped me before I'd finished and you said, I'll answer your question now. It's not morally right and just. I don't know what I can do about it, but I will look into it. Is that correct?
It is correct. And I will just clarify that I read your documents and it was and I think I should be very clear on this, my unqualified opinion, because I am not a qualified planning professional. It was my interpretation that there were errors in your documentation that were the council's fault, which in subsequently going through this process with all of you and others here, would, I believe, probably be subject to the withdrawal of a liability notice. But of course, that is pending a review by an actually qualified person on the subject.
Accept that. Later, and I am grateful to you, you allowed me to speak informally at this very executive meeting in November. And I was grateful for that. You asked Councillor Townsend to arrange a meeting with the head of planning, which happened, and I'm grateful, on the 7th of January, 25 weeks ago. We still have no resolution, no refund, even though publicly you said on record we would, cannot, will not make a decision. On the 28th of January, victims were given hope of justice when this full council unanimously agreed to hold reviews in line with West Berkshire. But the proposal before us this evening is not that. That hope has been crushed. This so-called review is nothing like West Berkshire. It excludes self-builds. Why? It requires victims to prove council errors, even though in most cases victims acted in good faith. I believe only 2 cases might qualify, and I will say they're afraid now to apply because under the conditions, there's no right of appeal if their case is dismissed. Council plans to spend 75,000 on an independent reviewer to hear 2 cases? That is not best value, and I would suggest that's avoidance. And then the question of non-enforcement. Simon Bird, who I respect, makes it clear that once a liability exists, it sticks. Late payment is mandatory. If my wife and I remain in our home for 20 years, our £70,000 charge would grow to £269,000, which includes £199,000 of late interest payment. Is that just? Is that proportionate? Is it moral? Douglas Edwards' case, he reminds us a public body must not act in ways that are oppressive, cause hardship, or are disproportionate. One victim has sold their home. Another has theirs on the market and is excluded from this review entirely. The head of planning, who's here tonight, said to councillors last week in an internal email, I would agree with Simon Burt's comments, the most draconian of recovery methods, and would suggest that the council would only resort to using such measures in extreme cases. I hold up before you my own demand notice, which threatens me with seizure of my home and imprisonment unless I pay £70,000 immediately as we went into first lockdown. And I've almost finished. Mr. Chairman, this is not just a poor policy you're discussing tonight. It's a disgrace in the way that it treats victims in Waverley. So I ask, unless the outcome of this meeting is predetermined, on behalf of all victims, would you as an executive take a stand? Reject this proposal. It's not best value. It does not correct injustice, and it fails the residents you were elected to serve. Thank you.
There are a number of points there, some of which will be covered in the points of clarity when I get to that section. I'm going to ask Claire if you're comfortable commenting on a specific case. If you aren't, please say, but if you are, please do.
Yes, I'm certainly comfortable. And Mr. Daly, I did email you this morning about the decision that you, maybe have been too busy today. So in terms of Mr. Daly's case, it has been fully reviewed by me. I've spent some significant time fully reviewing. The conclusion that I've come to is that the council did make the wrong decision in terms of how they assessed the 2018 application and whether or not you'd implemented it, and therefore whether the 2019 application was retrospective. My view is that this is looking at through the eyes of a planner. Obviously, the Ombudsman looked at it and found no maladministration in terms of process. The Valuation Office similarly supported the council's position, but that was through the eyes of a surveyor. But as a planner, I've concluded that the 2018 permission was implemented because it included in the description of development demolition, and when the site was visited, demolition had occurred and therefore you had commenced that development. I've got a 13-page report that I'm ready to share with you, which is what I contacted you about this morning.
Would you say what that decision is?
Sorry.
Would you share publicly what the decision is?
Yes, so publicly, I'm confirming that my decision is that we were wrong in pursuing SIL because we took the wrong decision about what planning route you had gone down, and therefore your SIL notice will be withdrawn and your funds and your payment that you've made to date refunded.
So I'm firstly, it's good that we've discussed that in an open session. That is certainly what the layman in the form of myself and Councillor Townsend concluded when we looked at the documents back in September and January, respectively. But I think what we've also just seen there is a clear example where there is an error from the council, where a liability notice can be withdrawn in line with the legal advice, which is the most straightforward avenue of this process. There's a few elements that we'll cover in the points of clarity. So for the moment, I'm just going to carry on with the public questions so that we can make sure that we've done all of those appropriately. So the next question I've got is from Mrs. Jane Crawford. Right, okay. So the question from Mrs. Crawford was, are the councillors and executive being influenced by a member of the executive consultancy team who had a disagreement with the councillor team in West Berkshire? I only know one of the councillors in West Berkshire, and I think I'm probably the only one that does know any of the councillors in West Berkshire. And that is because I, at the request of Mr. Daly, engaged in conversation with the leader of West Berkshire on their discretionary scheme. So to be clear, that's the only reason I've had any contact with them at all, is to talk about their scheme. And actually, it was probably after the September meeting that we had that I was sent a number of the documents from West Berkshire, and obviously this preceded any legal advice or any other matters that we were having. So in terms of the basis of the question, I obviously don't understand what they're talking about, and I don't believe there's any issues here. The next question I've got is from Ian Colvin. And I believe that Helen was going to ask a supplementary question for him. Sorry, Mrs. Grant.
So Ian's supplementary question is, does the executive agree that in saying homeowners who do large extensions should pay sale, as Councillor Follows said on the 1st of April council meeting, he could be seen as predetermined, and that this may have contributed to a recommendation in front of you that is narrowly defined so as to exclude almost all homeowner cases?
To be clear, stating a fact that currently under the policy of this council set in 2018, I believe it was, it is policy that homeowners building an extension over 100 square metres who do not file a proper exemption are subject to SIL.
They would have been entitled to an exemption with the right paperwork, though.
Merely stating a fact, though, that what the policy of the council is not a predetermination.
As ruthlessly applied by Waverley, yes.
Some conjecture which we'll deal with in just a moment. The next question I have is John Crawford.
John is caring for his wife.
Okay, and then we've got Martin Grant as the last one. Thank you, Mr. Grant.
Thank you. I think in the interest of brevity, no need for me to read out my question, but if I could just have some clarity on your answer, please. Where you refer to the discretionary review scheme will allow any householder to request a review of their SIL case, but you have excluded self-builds. Are they not householders?
Councillor Townsend, and this is something I want to pick up the self-build point.
Thank you, Mr. Grant. I'm going to defer to Claire, if you don't mind, to answer that because it's a technical question. Thank you.
Okay. With all scandals, and this is undoubtedly one, there is a pattern where those at the top, when they acknowledge a wrong, they don't put it right. They circle the wagons for whatever reason. And that's what's happened here. The outcome of all these scandals, which history tells us, is that the inevitable outcome is that the leader and leaderships are culpable and that they resign. Do you think this will inevitably be the case at Waverley?
Can I just tell you what I've observed so far? The one single case that has been assessed through the extant processes has shown that the council was at fault and is having a liability notice withdrawn, which was a process kicked off by Mr. Daly through myself and Councillor Townsend some months ago. So at the moment, we have a number of possibly alleged cases that need to go through a discretionary review process, which we're attempting to set up tonight. So at present, I see this as a number of cases that are still to be assessed, and a conclusion will be drawn from that. But from the one case that has been done so far, he is going to be given a refund. So from that perspective, at the moment, this is a process that seems to be working. So we'll cover the rest of this in the points of clarity, because you also just make sure the microphone is turned off or it confuses the chamber. Claire, would you mind just commenting on the self-build point? Because there was actually a question that was raised, not just at ONS, but was one I wanted to pick up tonight too, about this exclusion of self-build and what we're talking about here.
Yeah, so the report does recommend that self-build are not included in the discretionary review, and obviously it's up to exec whether they want to agree to that. The reason why it was excluded was because the definition of, the reference to householders sat within extensions and annexes rather than self-build, and it's for that reason that it's been excluded from the recommendation.
So just so we all remember sitting here in the front, that is something that I want to debate the merits of, because at the moment I'm not sold on why we've excluded that. Okay, then we are now on to the members' questions. So that's questions registered by councillors in advance of the meeting. And I have one question which was from Councillor Peter Clark. Do you wish to read your question or engage with the other bit of the response, or just come to a supplementary, Peter?
I think in the interest of brevity, I can move straight to my follow-up, if that's okay with you. I welcome the clarity the portfolio holder has made in her answer, which is obviously in print, that all householders who believe they've been incorrectly charged will qualify for a discretionary review. However, SIL is in danger of becoming the bogeyman at Waverley, which is completely undeserved when you think of the enormous benefits SIL contributions make towards the underfunded infrastructure across the borough. In the lifetime of our current local plan, SIL will contribute over £90 million to deserving bids from infrastructure providers. Highway safety, leisure centres, town centre improvements, extra GP facilities, extra school places and village halls. The list is endless. As an example, in April, this executive approved the County Council's bid for £2 million in SIL funds for extra school places in Farnham, which unlocked match funding of a further £10 million from the county, making £12 million in total. We need to encourage more bids to come forward, and all of this negative publicity will not help. Whatever we do for the householders incorrectly impacted by SIL charges, we should also consider any negative impact on the integrity of our SIL regime by not following the regulations laid down by government, albeit these regulations are deeply flawed. So my question, considering we are now halfway through the year, the question to the portfolio holder is how quickly can we now move forward with these discretionary reviews promised for the householders impacted in January at the council of this Waverley Borough Council. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter, for your supplementary question. And I agree on the importance that you stated there of SIL to our communities. This decision this evening by the executive is subject to a call-in. So whilst we would, really hope that we could implement this immediately, it could be the 10th of July, but everything is up and running and will be available for subject to call-in to get started. Thank you.
I think it's probably just also worth saying one of the other X factors in this is about the actual finding of an independent person to do the work. And we do need to factor that in as a potential risk in terms of the timeframes as well as exploration of other options. So, Liz.
That is correct. However, we are hoping that people will be able to submit their paperwork and the packs provided for the independent person to review, so we can get started on some of the groundwork. Thank you.
I mean, hopefully that will happen. Hopefully, in terms of appointment, that will happen quickly. But I mean, I imagine, going to be challenging. Right, in which case then, moving on to the next section of this, which is questions of clarity to the head of planning. I want to thank Claire for all of the work that she's done in getting us to this point, and also for agreeing to the slightly unusual process within the executive session of taking questions from the floor in the way that we've done. Although I'm limiting this bit really to effectively just establishing positions, factual positions, positions of common ground, so that we can aid the subsequent debate for the exec. It may be on this occasion, and I don't normally do this because I try and make sure the exec deal with the business themselves, as I believe is our duty. But in the primary debate, it is possible we may need to call on Claire, Candice, Richard, and others to give advice on matters as they arise. So. But this is just to deal with some of the basics that have been brought up over this process. I will just to clarify, me asking these questions is me not sitting here saying I have no idea what the answer is. In about 90% of the case of the questions I'm about to ask, I know the answer or believe I know the answer, but I'm wanting to make sure on the record that has been stated in public by a qualified officer, so everybody is absolutely clear as to what the position of the officer is. So Claire, could you just state who would be required to pay householder still and at what threshold?
So in terms of householders still, and just to clarify, the regulations themselves don't identify householders as a thing. It talks about residential annexes and extensions, and it also refers to the amount of floor space. So anybody that carries out a development which creates less than 100 square metres of new build floor space and doesn't include the creation of a new dwelling would not be liable because it would be seen as minor development exemption. Anybody that carries out over 100 square metres of new floor space could be liable to CIL. They need to then see whether they comply with the exemptions, which includes residential annexes over 100 square metres and residential extensions over 100 square metres, and then would need to fill in the necessary forms to apply for that exemption.
Just speaking as somebody who lives in a 2-bed flat, can you just give me an idea of what 100 square metres looks like in terms of, you know, compared to a house?
So 100 square metres would be a good size 3-bed, probably on some of our modern housing estates up to a 4-bed house.
So that would be an extension, roughly the size of the floor space of anyway, a house.
That's correct, yes.
Right. Okay. So what are the criteria for exemption and how do you apply for it?
So in terms of the criteria, some developments may be eligible for exemption, which includes, as I've just mentioned, residential annexes, extensions. There is a really strict criteria that's met, and that's set out in the regulations. That isn't Waverley's criteria, it's the legislation's criteria. And there is a really strict procedure that must be followed to obtain exemption. It should just be noted that development that is consented or granted permission retrospectively automatically does not apply for even applying for exemption.
So can you, I'm sorry, way to phrase this. What is the purpose of the exemption process? I mean, why are people not just automatically exempt? Is there a reason the policy exists that somebody has to effectively make that point of applying for the exemption?
Yeah, so really the reason for the exemption is that a developer could buy a house and choose to renovate it and put an extension up, and the intention isn't to give a developer an exemption. And therefore, there is a process to go through to demonstrate that you are genuinely a householder carrying out an extension or building an annex to your home. And therefore, the forms need to be filled in to demonstrate that you are eligible for that exemption.
And to be eligible for it, you're basically having to declare that this is your primary residence, i.e. you're not effectively a developer.
That's correct.
Right. Okay, just so I absolutely understand. Obviously, we've had this process running now for a number of years. Certainly, I was only just about a councillor, and I do recall voting against the local plan, ironically, back in 2018, when I was here by myself, pretty much. And we've obviously had quite a few people go through this process. I mean, I'm not going to ask you to put a number on it, but in general, would you say the majority of people who've engaged with this process have had a problem, or it's been broadly fine? I mean, one of the things that we've been trying to assess here broadly, and actually just commenting on a point Mr. Daly made about, is it best value to arrange something for 2 issues? That's actually a genuine question that's been discussed in this group. Are we talking about a proportional response here? How many, roughly, what are we talking about in terms of people who've applied through this process?
So in terms of the number of people that may apply through the process we're proposing, we think it's a small number, maybe 20. There is, as set out in the report, a whole series of appeal processes that you can go through anyway as part of the legislation. Probably the first one is Regulation 113. So if you think we've got the measurements wrong, bearing in mind that sometimes the plans we receive aren't right, there's different interpretations of what's usable floor space, then you can apply to us and we'll redo the calculation. And, you know, we have had a large number of situations where the plans haven't been as accurate. We haven't measured them correctly over the long period of time. And we've introduced new processes to ensure that the people measuring the plans are doing it correctly.
So ballpark though, is it in the order of say hundreds that we've had go through this process without issue and they filed their exemption and there's not been a problem? Is it in that kind of magnitude, or are we talking sort of 10, 15 or something like that?
No, we're talking of hundreds. So as an authority, we deal with roughly 3,500 planning applications a year, majority of which will be householder extensions.
Yeah.
So it's, you know, in the hundreds that we're talking about.
Which is not unsurprising in a borough that's quite wealthy and planning literate and so on. That's we see that in other expressions of planning issue, don't we? So at the moment where we've got potentially impacted people who may go through this process, they are likely to be, you know, a handful of % of the total who've been through this process as a whole.
That's correct.
Right. Okay. And the reason I ask that is mostly for this room is just to establish what a proportional response of the council and the executive is to this issue. And so to make sure that we have gauged this correctly. And also when we talk about things like self-build, what the changes would, what the sort of level of impact that would have if we were to modify the recommendations in any way. So I'll go back to my further questions. In terms of the actual forms that people have to fill in, don't get me wrong, I'm not a planner. And so nearly everything about the planning process looks particularly complicated. And I would certainly be hiring somebody to act on my behalf if I were engaging in it. But the forms themselves have been described as difficult. Can you just confirm your view of those forms, and do we have any power to change them?
No, as with planning application forms, they're national forms, they're submitted through a portal. So we've got no power whatsoever to change the design or the form of those forms.
I know we've covered this one a little bit in a couple of ways tonight, but can we withdraw a liability notice under any circumstances?
We can only legally withdraw a liability notice if the council has made an error.
Do we give a view as to what a council error is? Because as far as I can see in the report, we've deliberately kept that open, and so not to close off all of the avenues of potential council error. That's my lay reading of it.
No, we do not give. There is no definition of what is an error, and nor would we give a definition, because we would inevitably have missed something, and in doing so, prejudice the outcome of a case review.
Which is slightly strange, because at ONS and other places, it's been alleged that by not defining what the council considers an error, that we're actually intending to reduce the scope of the inquiry. But actually, by not defining it, we are keeping it as open as possible, it sounds like.
That's absolutely correct.
Thank you. So the second one, following on from the liability questions, it's been put to me by a number of members and a few other places. Can we modify or zero out an existing liability notice?
So again, we can only do that if we have made an error. So we can't just decide that it'd be easier if we put a 0 on the liability notice. It's only in a case where the council have made an error in accordance with the regulations.
And apologies to follow on from that. Even if we could zero out a liability notice, would the liability notice still standing on somebody's property cause any impacts to that person regardless?
So liability notices are recorded and they show up in land searches. So if you were buying a property or and you had a diligent solicitor acting on your behalf, I think a solicitor may question if there was a liability notice with a 0, if there was some suggestion that there was still a civil charge that could be attached to that development.
Thank you. So in terms of the discretionary review process as outlined in the reports tonight, it has been alleged that we are preventing people from accessing it by defining it in the way that we have, but also that it won't consider any issues beyond a council error. So will the proposed discretionary review consider any other issues or just errors the council has made?
So the discretionary review will look at the whole case from the submission of the application through. It will only find in favour of the applicant if there is an error by the council, but possibly, as I've just described with Mr. Daly, that error could be right at the point where we receive an application and technically validated. And if we validate it as one type of application and it's actually legally and technically another type of application, then that would be an error that would lead us down a potentially different path from the path we'd taken.
So to me, that sounds like there might be quite a broad category of things that would qualify as an error. But if we're moving out of the realm of council error into resident error, will we be picking up any of those issues where resident error is resident or a residence agent's error is something? Will that be something picked up as part of the review?
So yes, as part of the review, we want this to also be a learning exercise for us. As I think I've said in a number of meetings, there have been significant improvements to the whole SIL journey over the years as we've learned more about it. But any error that we do find that may be a learning point, so whether it's ours or whether it's an agent or an applicant, we will share that in the 6-monthly report that we propose to executive, and also share what we're going to do about that to help avoid that error happening again.
So that covers the learning to stop something happening again point, but there may be a group of residents who aren't subject to a council error who have made some kind of error. Are we able to take any actions to redress their issues on a case-by-case basis as a result of this review?
So under the review, no, because lawfully we can only withdraw the liability notice if the council have made an error, not if an agent or that the household or the property owner has made that error.
So are we genuinely unable to assist anybody who's had any other kind of error in any other way?
Under this review, part of the recommendation of tonight's report is that we also request that the executive request that the executive working group look at our enforcement policy. That is discretionary, and that may help the situations that some residents find themselves in where they won't be eligible for a refund of SIL because they've made the error. But it will give us the discretionary powers around whether or not we take enforcement action.
So I'm saying this just for clarity. I think I get the gist. So in practice, the discretionary review's first priority will be to consider issues where the council has made some kind of error and can therefore withdraw a liability notice. We've then got other issues that may have been raised through that process. Partly that inform our learning about how to do this better in the future. And partly these will be included in the 6-monthly report so that a subsequent review of how we enforce, which is with a group that has already been set up, can look at how we deal with those other issues on a case-by-case basis.
That's correct.
I really just wanted to repeat that because as far as I am concerned, is our officer telling me that the other issues that are raised beyond council error is something that is addressed by this discretionary review. And the fact that we are not limiting the scope of what is considered a council error is not us poorly defining the matter and opening ourselves up to an issue. It is ensuring we don't ill-define it and exclude people from the process at all. So actually, the call from me here would be, if you think you have an issue, raise an issue with the discretionary review so that you can have the process checked end to end. Either you might find that you are subject to a council error, in which case you can go through the same process that Mr. Daly has gone through, but faster because we'll have a process set up. Or if you've got those other issues, they'll be dealt with as part of the review of enforcement and other issues. So at the moment, as far as I can see, all of the theoretical possibilities are dealt with in this. And I have now heard in public from an officer telling me that's the case. And I'll be asking the executive if they agree with that interpretation, because we will be the ones tasked with making sure that is followed through. And then finally, where there are any refunds to be issued. Now, obviously, if we're talking about non-liability, talking about that second category, that's a little bit difficult because it's enforcement. In terms of those liability notices, if they're withdrawn, where does that refund come from in terms of council accounts?
So, yeah, Richard or Candice might want to come in, but just to confirm, if it's outside the discretionary review, as in we are deciding to not enforce the payment of a SIL, then that would have to be funded through a source outside the SIL pot. And I've got shaking agreement from both sides.
Well, I think I need to ask, when you say source outside the SIL pot, can you specify what you mean by that?
I can, absolutely, yes. So if it's outside of this discretionary review, it would need to come through council reserves. So existing general fund reserves would need to be used.
Now, do any other members of the executive have any questions for clarity that need to be answered? If there are questions raised by members when they speak in their own section, I will obviously ensure that we try to respond to those. But do any of the members of the exec have a question of clarity they want to put to any of our officers at the moment? No. Right, in which case then I'm going to move to Councillor Townsend to introduce the report, at which point I will move to the ONS recommendations. So Councillor Townsend, if you'd like to introduce the report.
Thank you, Leader, and apologies if I repeat any of the points that Claire makes, but in moving the motion, obviously I need to make sure that I cover every point.
And before you start, please to second in this case, so it's properly recorded.
Thank you, Leader. I became aware of Mr. Daly's case at the end of last year and met with him on the 7th of January, by which point he had exhausted both the appeal process through the Ombudsman and the Evaluation Office Agency, regrettably neither found in his favour. Despite this, the Assistant Director of Planning and I met with him to see if there was anything further we could do. I was genuinely moved by Mr. Daly's account of what he and his wife had experienced. Both the Assistant Director and I felt there were grounds to look at his case again with a fresh pair of eyes, and we have never wavered from that commitment. I do regret that this decision has taken longer than any of us anticipated. I've apologised to Mr. Daly directly for that delay, but I must also stress it was important that the investigation into his case was full and thorough. And I'm delighted that this decision has been made and been made public this evening. I wasn't going to announce that, Mr. Daly, but seeing as you requested for it to be published, I hope that you will also agree for your report to be published for full transparency. Thank you. This executive takes its responsibilities extremely seriously. We act with diligence and with compassion. But we are also clear that tonight's decision must withstand scrutiny. It must operate within the law, and it must not create a two-tier SIL system, one that complies with the law and another which does not. This could undermine infrastructure funding for our residents and could result in our decisions being challenged in the High Court and quashed. Some members have sought to underplay these risks. Some have even suggested we can simply set aside legislation and legal advice with little consequence. But I say this clearly, those same members would likely be the first to criticise should the council be taken to judicial review, perhaps by a developer questioning whether they've been treated unfairly by this council. The council has taken the unusual and I believe commendable step of publishing its legal advice in full, driven by our commitment to transparency. That advice was provided by Simon Bird KC, a highly respected barrister, head of chambers at Francis Taylor Building and a judge on SIL matters. Simon Bird makes it clear unequal treatment of those paying SIL could undermine the very integrity of the system. That system, as Councillor Clark has mentioned this evening, has delivered real results for Waverley. £2 million for the secondary school places in Farnham, funding towards a new leisure centre in Cranley, funding towards community facilities, walking routes, a pump track and road schemes, as well as helping to fund a new GP practice in Farnham, amongst many other projects, which are fully published on our website. This system matters, and it should not be undermined in haste or under pressure just because the media spotlight happens to be on us. We are a serious administration. We have listened carefully and we have worked hard to build a process that is fair, robust and legally sound. On the 28th of January, the Leader of the Opposition brought a motion to full council. That motion called for a discretionary review process in line with West Berkshire. It passed, and the minutes record our commitment to explore that model. But to suggest that a single motion was all that was needed to implement a review, that is either inexperience or willful misunderstanding of how council governance works. Members should know, and I believe most do, that this requires officer input, a formal report to executive, proper scrutiny, the assessment of risk, legal checks and financial clarity. That includes understanding whether refunds can legally come from the SIL pot or from our reserves. Now turning to the legislation. As it stands, anyone applying for permission for an extension or annex over 100 square metres must apply for an exemption before starting work. And if they don't, they become liable and a SIL notice is issued. That is the law. It is clearly written, but we fully accept it is complex, inflexible, and the forms, as has been stated before, are not user-friendly. We completely recognise the real distress caused when householders fall foul of these rules through no fault of their own. The powers this council has to withdraw those SIL liability notices have been carefully considered. On the 27th of February, Mr. Daly submitted legal advice from his own KC, Douglas Edwards. Mr. Edwards argues that, or advises that, Regulation 65(7) gives councils a general discretion to withdraw a liability notice where appropriate, such as in cases of hardship or where the outcome is clearly disproportionate or oppressive. Although Mr. Edwards makes comment about the approach taken in his advice by West Berkshire, he does not comment on whether it had investigated the statutory powers to introduce its approach. Our own advice from Simon Bird KC considers the advice from Douglas Edwards in detail. His view is clear. Regulation 65(7), correctly interpreted, does not provide a general discretion to cancel liability notices simply to relieve householders of the consequences of their mistakes. On the specific question of West Berkshire and whether they had statutory powers to introduce their approach, Simon Bird in his advice states that that is a question which, from my research into the West Berkshire decision-making process, that council did not, in fact, ever properly engage with. It is, however, worth noting that both West Berkshire and Woking councils appear to agree with Simon Bird's interpretation that you cannot withdraw a liability notice in the case of an error by the householder. Now, I'm also aware that concerns have been raised about the level of SIL charges in Waverley. These charges were adopted in 2019 by the previous administration. Yes, they are considered high, but they were independently examined and passed and were seen as necessary to support the infrastructure demands of development in our borough. It's unfortunate that the original decision to implement SIL did not include any relief for exceptional circumstances, nor did it provide any enforcement policy. That was an oversight, but I'm pleased to say we are now addressing this. A review of the enforcement policy is a priority for the established executive working group. This may give officers greater discretion on how and when to enforce, though it will not allow us to withdraw a liability notice. We have heard loud calls from some members for the council to act outside of its powers, regardless of the consequences. But this executive has a duty to consider all the evidence. That includes the council motion, the recommendations from ONS, officer advice and legal opinion before reaching a conclusion. I know each of you here has taken this matter seriously and with a great deal of concern, and the impact on the householders who have been in contact with us, you have been clearly moved by. I know that we all want to see a fair result, ideally the withdrawal of liability notices, the lifting of legal charges on residents' homes and refunds where payments have been made. That's what this review seeks to deliver. but in a way that is legal. So far, around 5 residents have been in direct contact with us as a council, and we believe, as Claire has stated earlier, there may be up to 20. I encourage all of them to come forward. Each case will be reviewed independently. They don't need to be afraid at all of the outcome. As outlined in the report, we have outlined that every householder that comes forward will have a review, and furthermore, reports and outcomes will be published for full transparency. It is encouraging, as the leader has commented on, that the majority of residents appear to be navigating the process correctly. But I'm sure that a clearer picture will emerge as the review progresses. I want to take a moment to thank our officers, and particularly the Assistant Director of Planning, who has worked tirelessly, including nights and weekends, to support members, meet deadlines and gather the evidence we need. In addition to the review process, the Council will also be looking at how we allocate strategic SIL funding to ensure greater transparency, a stronger focus on infrastructure priorities and better outcomes for our communities. The Council is completely transparent on the SIL and Section 106 monies that it collects, and this is published online. However, although it collects these funds, it relies on projects being submitted by the public infrastructure providers like Surrey County Council for areas like roads and transport, the NHS and other medical facilities for improvements to healthcare, and also by schools and other educational establishments. Our officers actively engage with those providers every year, but we remain disappointed with the quantity of proposals submitted. We are committed to reviewing this process as part of the raft of measures outlined in the report and to remove any potential barriers and encourage more bids. I firmly reject the claim that money is sitting idle, but I agree that the system must work better for our communities. So tonight, I urge my fellow executive members to approve the implementation of a discretionary householder review as set out in Appendix 1 of this report. Please also approve the necessary budget to appoint an independent reviewer for each case. Request that the Executive Working Group prioritises the review of our enforcement policy. And finally, that you note the wider programme of improvements that we are committed to undertaking. The 4 recommendations are set out clearly on page 29 of your agenda. Approving these recommendations isn't just about resolving individual cases, it's about making the system fairer and more transparent for everyone. It's a chance to show that we've listened, that we take responsibility and that we're willing to improve how we work. This review helps to rebuild confidence in the process and sets a clearer path for householders in the future. Any further delay would result in further uncertainty for householders. And to be honest, they've waited long enough. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Townsend. Can I just quickly pause just for a moment? I need to confer with the monitoring officer briefly. Okay, I'm going to move to the ONS recommendations now. There is a matter in the background on one of the clauses that I want to address in the debate, but whilst the MO and the Head of Planning discuss that in the background, we'll move to the ONS recommendations. Councillor Coburn, one moment while I just bring up the right thing for me to read. First of all, thank you for attending this evening. I know you were intending to speak anyway, but thank you for coming along to take questions on the ONS recommendations. There were 4 recommendations from your committee. The first is the executive considers offering a full review to every householder, regardless of who made errors, and possible full financial settlement as determined by the appointed independent person, which could be ex gratia and that could be funded by SIL interest. So I did just have a couple of follow-up questions, notwithstanding the comments that Claire herself has made about how we're going to take the management of errors, whether it be the council or residents. In terms of, could you just outline to me what you mean by an ex gratia scheme and what that would involve? And if that scheme is actually legal, and can it be funded from SIL interest, as your committee stated?
Thank you. Yes, certainly we can do an ex gratia payment scheme, and there are very strict rules for that. in terms of documentation and setting it out right at the beginning, but we do have that power under sort of public law. I think really what the group was trying to say was that the spirit of what we asked for in January was not being presented to it. And this was our way of trying to redress that, because certainly as long as we set up a scheme, a proper scheme, there's got to be full transparency, all the things, the financial prudence, there's got to be a rationale, and there's got to be documentation. But we can, in fact, do an ex gratia payment scheme, as long as we set it up accurately.
First of all, can I just quickly ask the monitoring officer to just comment on the legality of ex gratia schemes and that process, please?
So any such scheme wouldn't be in accordance with the SIL regulations and isn't provided for within that legislative scheme. The council does have the general power of competence, which enables it to do anything that an individual would do. However, that power is limited and needs to be interpreted in accordance with all of the other statutory requirements upon the council, which includes the best value duty in terms of all the decisions that we take. So in order to exercise that power, we would need to review every case on an individual basis to consider whether or not it met the criteria and whether we were acting in accordance with our best value duty in making such a payment to such a scheme.
Can I come back?
Yeah, just before you do, also you mentioned the phrase public law. Could you state which laws you're talking about?
Well, probably the Local Government Act 72, that's always a good one, isn't it? And obviously powers within the Localism Act. We've got certain powers. And with ex gratia payments, it's really when there's a moral obligation. I'm not asking anyone to break the law. I'm not asking anyone to support the SIL regs as they stand. I think they're a mess and are badly written and should be changed. But what I'm saying at the moment is we have an issue with distressed, certainly householders, but I think the councillors that have been involved are also distressed with this. And there are ways of moving this forward more quickly. And if the will is there, and that's the difference, if the will is there, then I think we could do a scheme. And that's what we voted for as a committee. And we did take votes on all of this.
I was present. You had a clarification.
Yes, I just wanted to clarify, there is no power under the Local Government Act 1972. The general power of competence comes from the Localism Act 2011. And it would be under that power. There is no specific power which would give the council the ability to make an ex gratia payment in these particular circumstances. The only power that we have been able to look at fitting this under would be under the general power of competence.
Can I just go back again? Because we do actually have a duty, to be fair, to have set a relationship between our individuals, our residents, and us as a public authority. That's one of our duties under public law. I mean, you can tell me which one it is, but public law, as we know, is a whole load of laws all put together that we have to obey. And one of them is that we have to act lawfully, and I'm not asking anyone to act, and nor is the committee, rationally and fairly. And that's where we started from with the committee, because we feel that we're not doing that as a council by tearing up what we agreed in January. And the word declaratory, which was the first time I'd used it, and I hope I won't be using it too often, we didn't think it was a declaratory motion. We thought it was a motion that was going to be brought forward and would help our residents now. I can understand why we need to look at our SIL policy, and I can understand why we should ask the government to look at its SIL regs. But that doesn't alter the fact that we've got people who are suffering now. And what we were trying to do as a committee was put in place something that it could run alongside a review, but it could actually address the issues now. And I don't think it is illegal.
Can I just ask, well, firstly, this is just me stating, I have the obligation of having to make sure we are following the law, and I have an obligation to listen to the qualified advice being given to me by our legal and planning officers. Councillor Coburn, this is just really a question from me. If these concerns were so evident and so obvious, why is it that you voted for this in 2018 in the first place?
for the same reason that you and Councillor Townsend voted for it.
I did not, Councillor Coburn.
I'm sorry, in 2019, when we put it forward, I don't think anyone objected. But let's be honest. Well, I can't say, leader. I'm not a nerd like you. I don't make notes of the. I don't make notes of these things. But one thing we can say is that when we brought in the SIL regs, SIL policy, it was all very new. And I am saying, and the committee said further down in some of the recommendations, that we expect that there were errors made in that early part by officers, maybe our processes weren't. And this is what West Berkshire just accepted. They didn't, can I just finish talking once without being interrupted? So I've lost my thread now, but basically West Berkshire said, you know, if we have contributed in any way to these errors, we should be held responsible. And that is what we voted for in January 28th earlier this year. And that is what we were just trying to get back to in our recommendations.
Before I bring in Liz, as there are a number of ONS members in here, my request when you're making recommendations, and obviously I can only make requests, things that make it easier for the exec to process them. If you make statements that say in relation to public law or legal matters or something like that, bearing in mind the chair always has the monitoring officer next to them, my really serious request would be you specify which law, which article, which act, which regulation, so that it is a lot easier for us to engage with the substance. That's not me trying to make a political point. It is just very difficult here to engage with generic statements on legality when that was literally done next to the monitoring officer and advice could have been sought very, very quickly to specify what you were talking about. Liz, do you want to just comment before I come to the next one?
Yeah, I do. And you know, I totally sympathise with what Councillor Coburn is saying. However, my real concern is that this will result in a considerable delay, and there's no mechanism under any kind of ex gratia scheme to withdraw liability notices, and that is the ultimate that we want. And Councillor Coburn talks about errors being made by officers in early days. Well, they will be picked up by this review. That's exactly what this review is set up. Any errors will be picked up. And I would also say that I'm very happy under my SIL review and reform executive working group that has been set up already. I'm quite happy if, and Councillor Coburn is also a member of that group, I'm quite happy for this to be raised in that group and for us to look at this. But I do not want to delay the justice for those people where the council has made an error and where we can legally and we have the mechanism to withdraw the SIL liability notices, remove the charge of their property and provide them where they have paid with a refund. And I would urge councillors not to delay this any further. These people have waited long enough. Thank you.
Thank you. Just on the next one then. So the apologies, Mark.
Thank you, Leader. You know, I do want to understand these recommendations so that we can consider them properly. So on this first one, the opening sentence talks about regardless of who made the errors, a financial settlement, whatever it is, ex gratia, that could be funded by the SIL interest. So I just want to marry that up with what we heard a little bit earlier on. I think we heard from our 151 and from Candice that if the error is made by the council, then the liability notice is withdrawn, and to the extent that SIL has been paid into the SIL pot, it is the SIL pot that funds the refund. So the question then is, if a payment is made, a discretionary payment is made for a valid SIL notice, could be funded by the SIL interest. Well, as far as I know, we don't have a SIL interest fund. We have a general fund, as Candice pointed out, and the general fund is where the SIL interest goes. It's also where council taxpayers' money goes. It's where car parking revenues go, and it funds all of our services and our operations. So it would be useful to have a steer from ONS because we have to run a balanced budget. If we are talking here about putting a cost burden on the general fund, where that cost would be funded from. Would it be from cost saving somewhere? Would we like to know, or would it be from income from other sources? It would just be helpful for me to understand.
I believe Candice did opine on this during the session itself. Did you want to add anything at this point, Candice?
No. So just, yeah, I mean, to clarify, obviously we've talked about the interest earned on SIL receipts. We budget for all of our investment income and the interest earned on that income. So any interest earned as part of SIL would have been part of a balanced budget. So it's not that we've put those funds elsewhere and it's sat in a reserve. So as Councillor Merriweather said, we'd either have to make savings, raise income, or we would have to change the use of current earmarked reserves if we wanted to fund those payments.
And just for full transparency, and so I can say it to you in the same way I just asked it of the monitoring officer, I asked her while Mark was talking, if you were asked to, could you cobble together a legal justification to do an ex gratia scheme in this way in basically any circumstances? And Claire, did you want to comment?
I just want to be very, very clear from the outset that as a local authority, we only have the power to do things that we are given through statute. Those powers are set out in numerous pieces of legislation. We do have a general power of competence under Section 1 of the Localism Act 2011. That is the only power under which we would be able to apply such a scheme. There is no power in any other act, nor does it appear within the SIL regulations. In order to use that power, as with any of our powers, we'd still have to be satisfied that we were complying with the best value duty and that we were acting fairly, consistently, reasonably and proportionately in respect of using that power. So it's not fair to say that the legislation generally gives us powers to do anything that we want to do. It doesn't. Our powers are very specifically defined within legislation, and as a council, we follow those rules.
Thank you, Claire. Moving then on to the next recommendation. The executive considers a broader definition of what an error of the council may mean, including the area of signposting since 2019. Now, I actually said, I was at the back of the room on this one. This was actually, I think, from the amendment that Councillor Beeman moved. I actually said at the back here that the recommendation wasn't clear and I needed to understand what broader definition meant. And actually, since that point, I went and had the discussion as to what the risk of actually stating any definition at all was. And you've heard a very clear rationale from the head of planning that actually there is a danger that by specifying something, we'll forget something or something that we hadn't thought of might come up. And actually in the process, we limit residents' ability to apply to this. But as a result, Councillor Coburn, did you want to comment on that? Because at the moment, I'm not minded to accept that recommendation because it restricts the access to the review.
Yes, remember, this was sent out long before I saw it. You know, I did not see these in advance. I knew what we'd said. So I can understand sometimes when you read them, you think, well, that should have been a bit stronger. I mean, I think what we're trying to say in that one and bullet point 4 is much the same thing, isn't it? Because we're talking about going back and we've been reassured that this will happen in any case. But I think, you know, if we are trying to redress a wrong, and we have a moral obligation, if people have suffered a loss, and it doesn't have to be financial, we do have a moral obligation, if, you know, to look at it and see whether it does warrant redress. And I think what we're trying to say here is go in open-minded, don't put in any definition of error. And then when you look at the processes that were in place from 2019 onwards, if, for example, anything we did prevented a resident from doing something correctly, if we'd put proper checks and balances in, they would not have filled that form in wrongly, then I think we have to take a moral responsibility for that. It's not just the same as a sort of straightforward error. So I think what we're trying to do is make this as broad as possible within the law.
So at the moment, I'm sticking with the officer's original point, and has been clarified here, that actually putting in a definition of a council error is in fact something that will restrict access to the discretionary review. So bearing in mind the executive, the ONS recommendation is that we consider a broader definition of what an error of the council is. We don't have a definition of an error of the council in the report, and quite specific. It is as broad as it can be by restricting it in no way at all. And that is on purpose, as has been clarified by the officer present this evening. And then finally, just as a couple of extra ones here, that the executive ensures that the operational briefing given to the independent person takes the same governance route as this report. Now, I've heard time and time again of people wanting this to go as fast as possible. And if I were so minded to try and delay this, which I'm definitely not, but let's just say I was, I would find no easier way of delaying this than by agreeing to that recommendation. Because as far as I've understood that recommendation and how it was articulated in the committee by members, you want that briefing for the independent person to go right through the entire committee cycle, as did this report. Is that your intention, Councillor Cockburn?
Was the intention of the committee? Yes, Leader.
Then I have to say I'm going to put to members that we disagree with that recommendation, as I think all it would do is fundamentally delay this beyond measure. Liz.
I would also like to say that we must maintain the independence of this person. And if it goes through ONS, what are they going to do? Change the recommendation, make recommendations on that recommendation. What we're looking at is having a streamlined approach. The qualified person, whether that be a qualified CIL planning officer or a solicitor, will look at all of the information and will come to their conclusion, which will be presented back to the Assistant Director of Planning. They will be made public, those reports. Therefore, they will be subject to anyone to look at. And also, as was mentioned earlier, we will have a review of cases 6 monthly coming to executive as well, to ensure that we are happy with the process as it's going at that point. So I really don't think that we need to build in any more delays, and we do need to maintain the independence of that person. Thank you.
So that covers all of the recommendations from the ONS. Obviously, there's 4 recommendations, but they cover overlapping principles that we've covered in some parts tonight. I would just reiterate my request to ONS that if you're stating legal principles, please use the monitoring officer to have those drafted into the recommendations, so it's very clear then what we're talking about. I was also surprised to see no real intent to scrutinise the actual legal advice that we were provided as a council. There were no references to it almost the entire session, and there were no references to it really in the recommendations from ONS. So it makes it slightly challenging for the executive to actually grasp that. And that is why I had those questions of clarity asked at the beginning of the session, so that we could get to some of the reality of the situation in the absence of there being any definitions offered in the recommendations from ONS. Now, there are a number of things that, as part of the recommendations, I will be considering when we get to the main debate. And there's a discussion I will need to very quickly have with the MO on that subject too. I'm now going to bring it to the open part of the debate, which starts with the members who are registered to speak. The very first one of which I believe is Councillor Austin.
Thank you. This critical vote tonight affects livelihoods, and for some it will affect the very roof over our residents' heads. We urge you in the strongest possible terms to vote against this recommendation. The proposed review scheme is not fit for purpose. The majority of those hit by these charges will not qualify to even apply under the scheme. Some will not apply because of the way the scheme is drafted. The scheme does not reflect the will of full council. I just ask you for a minute to imagine how you would feel if an honest mistake on a planning form led to a charge of 50k, 100k, the threat of imprisonment. Now you must sell your family home to pay the council. Worse, what if your elected representatives ignored your pleas, in some cases for years, and now hide behind procedure and other legal justifications of best value than otherwise, instead of supporting you in your hour of need? Now, I just want to say right now how thrilled I am that we call him Councillor Daly, and Steve and Caroline Daly are getting their money back. That is all we ask for. But you have held on for 25 weeks in order to do what you've done tonight, which some would call a very cheap publicity stunt. How on earth are the other people who have been impacted by these charges going to feel about this? I believe there is no political will from the people sitting on this executive to listen or to really help these residents. It's all about damage limitation. Evidenced by our leaders' repeated incorrect statements that those charged were building large extensions. The truth is, many of these people have lost the ability to offset floor area. So it was correct. You know, it's not correct that they should have paid SIL. Some of them have been extended by as little as 3 square metres. Crucially, they'd all have been exempt if they filled the paperwork out correctly. Did our council help them to do that? We all acknowledge that SIL legislation is deeply flawed. Over 150 councils operate SIL, but only at Waverley and West Berkshire have we seen this clustering of cases. That points not to bad luck, but to local systemic failure, potential maladministration, and a breach of duty of our duty of care. What, if any, help did Waverley give our residents? The evidence in front of us suggests the council were razor-focused on collecting cash. The SIL victims group has undertaken a freedom of information request for every SIL charging authority across the UK. So far, responses received demonstrate many councils do apply common sense to SIL regulations for householders. For example, by offering periods of grace to submit notices, by contacting residents, reminding them throughout the process if they fail to submit forms. It's an absolute tragedy that this did not happen at Waverley, which has lost, I think, sight of its duty of care to the people it serves. We read yet another resident's testimony last night who, like others before him, experienced a SIL team using extraordinary measures to attempt to extract SIL and SIL interest, actions which could be described as entrapment. Surely we must together call for a broad, independent investigation of all SIL cases and historic SIL practices at Waverley. West Berkshire's leader, Jeff Brooks, implemented the discretionary review we Waverley councillors voted to follow. And he said, in 32 years as a councillor, this is the most egregious example of a council using the letter of the law to its advantage. It may have been legally correct, but it was morally reprehensible. We heard much of that sentiment echoed by our long-standing Waverley councillors last week. What Waverley is proposing tonight is an attempt to sweep serious concerns about SIL practices at our council under the carpet. For the sake of residents, for transparency, and to limit further damage to our council's reputation, please listen to what your fellow councillors and these victims are saying loud and clear. Reject this proposal. I just want to make one final point. Waverley has accrued substantial SIL interest into the general fund. If we multiply the £24 million sitting in our bank account as at March 2025 to the annual return of the general fund, it was 1.17 million this year. That's a rough broad brush estimate. So I think it is absolutely fair, reasonable and proportionate that we would use a very small amount of that money towards ex gratia payments to right some of the wrongs. I hope an independent investigation would conclude that we and our council had experienced. Thank you.
To be clear, the monitoring officer has now said 3 times in 3 different ways that an ex gratia scheme wouldn't be possible, just to be clear. So I'm now going on to the next speaker. And actually, to be honest, I sometimes refer to Mr. Daly as Councillor Daly because he has actually been here and spoken more than some members that I can name. But next we've got Councillor Barker-Lomax.
Thank you. We in the opposition observe a culture that appears designed not to support residents, but to charge them. We hear stories from constituents where planning applications are reinterpreted and delayed, where goalposts are shifted, and where clarity is withheld. We hear stories that make the council's conduct seem to us and to our constituents not about pursuing a just policy, rather about callously generating money. We think that this is not how a council should operate and that Waverley should be held to account. We call for an independent investigation into how often and why enforcement and civil penalties are being applied. If the council's strategy is to use civil law to raise revenue, then it is the public, not the developers, who will pay the price.
Thank you, Councillor Barker-Lomax. Councillor Coburn.
Thank you, Leader. I mean, I really think you've heard enough from me, but I will just say that this is about natural justice. You know, I'm really getting fed up to the back teeth with being told it's unlawful, we've got to follow this line, this line, this line. I can understand we have to act with propriety, but we also have a moral obligation to be fair. And that is one thing that I don't think we've been acting lawfully, rationally and fairly in the way we have been approaching administering our own CIL policy. And I really do think there's a time here when natural justice really ought to trump all the rest of the verbiage. Thank you.
For the record, and I'm sure I'm not the only executive member here, there are umpteen times where I would love to use natural justice as an example, as a precedent for doing exactly what I damn well like when I see things the government do that are bad. Certainly, I've had to endure that as the leader of this council for the last 4 years, and as before that as a member of this council since 2017. I won't even need to go to the members of the executive to ask them to list the number of things they would love to just crack on and do without the government. There are tons of things. Climate change, affordable housing, you name it, there are a bunch. So this natural justice trumping the law matter is something that you can only really say in opposition. I've now got
You're not
Councillor
misquoting me, Leader. I did not say it trumps the law.
You literally just said that, Councillor Coburn.
I said it trumps verbiage. That is different.
Councillor Hussaini.
Good evening. I speak today with a heavy sense of disappointment, not just in the process we've witnessed around CIL enforcement, but in the direction this executive appears to be taking. We are not here as a council to catch people out. We are not here to generate revenue through entrapment or coercion. We are here as councillors to serve our communities, to support, guide, and represent the very people who elected us. That is a fundamental duty of public office. When residents are left feeling that their council is deliberately setting traps, confusing them with complex paperwork and exploiting genuine mistakes, something has gone terribly wrong. This is not a public service. This is this is not public service. This is revenue generation at the expense of trust. And trust, once lost, is hard to earn back. And it's not just trust that's lost. CIL affected residents across the borough have felt the pain. Some have had to remortgage their house, some had to sell their house, and others had to take out huge loans to pay the unfair CIL charges. And all of them, I would suspect, have been under immense stress with their lives put in limbo for months on end. That is exactly why full council, in a democratic and cross-party vote, supported a review, one that would mirror the transparent and resident-focused approach taken by West Berkshire. This wasn't a symbolic gesture. It was a mandate from the chamber to do better, to reflect, to put things right. If we want to hold our heads up high as councillors, as people representing the public, to act in their best interest, we must follow through with this review, not to defend the status quo, but to examine it honestly and rebuild the relationships between the council and the people it exists to serve. Let's remember what we are here for and act accordingly. Thank you.
Probably just worth reminding people that we did bring this discretionary review item to executive to enable us to have the review, to do that kind of work. And I don't know other way I could really say this. If council were to pass a resolution to make me Pope, it could pass it, but it wouldn't make it happen. It wouldn't be legal. It wouldn't be in its scope or its powers. And there is a point where I think the argument should have been, was it lawful for council to pass such a motion? And that is something that I think we need to, on this side of the fence, reflect on why that happened in that way. But that doesn't mean that council can do things outside of its powers. I've got Councillor Hyman on the Zoom, I believe.
You have indeed. Thank you very much, Leader. I won't repeat what Councillor Coburn and Councillor Austin and Barker Lomax and Zaney have just said, although I agree with almost every word there. I'm not sure that the executive is right, however, to rely on Simon Bird's opinion. Whilst effectively junking the experience of Mr. Edwards, who has got a lot, if not more, experience himself. And this is a big issue. Leader, you said that you're surprised that the ONS did not refer to a need to scrutinise legal advice. Well, you were at the ONS meeting, and you know that I spoke on that and used much of my 4 minutes on that. The big issue is that we're not allowed, haven't been allowed, and won't be, it appears, to properly scrutinise and interrogate the opinions to achieve what would be a no risk or the lowest risk possible interpretation. And I don't see why that shouldn't be possible. I've been through it. I've found a significant inconsistencies which seem apparent to me, which I would very much like to argue with people who are and debate properly, so that we can reach a resolution on this. But we can't do that in 4 minutes. The independent person's hands will be similarly tied, I assume. They are not going to get the opportunity to interrogate and find out how they should be interpreting the law. So how are we going to, as Councillor Townsend would say, maintain their independence? They won't be. They will be controlled. They won't be allowed to interrogate the legal position. How are we going to find somebody who would take that job on, honestly, who isn't a patsy? They won't be allowed to decide, it seems, that not informing an applicant of the likely or possible liability for SIL, if they were, for instance, to take the council's advice on putting in a Section 73 application rather than a minor material, a non-material amendment, whether the people were aware. And of course, that's something which Mr. Bird's opinion seems to assume that everybody knows. Well, if we don't know, if we've got two heavyweight opinions with opposing views, how can Mr. Bird assume that householders can digest and understand all the pitfalls of CIL law when we and barristers don't seem to be able to? We really need to look at this further before, and I mean, I am so happy for Mr. Daly, and I apologise profusely. We can't apologise enough for the past 6 months. He's been through, in fact, the years of grief and unpleasantness and work that he's had to go through to get to where it is for him. And I am concerned that it's not going to be that other people aren't going to get a resolution that might be fair for them. Because the independent person is going to have the rules enforced upon them. I don't think this will work unless we do what you said you were surprised no one had asked for, but you know full well that I had, that the legal advice needs to be properly sorted before we go forward and try and find an independent person who will take the job on. Otherwise, it'll just be a sham. And I know a lot of people think that it is, and it's public perception, a matter of perception here. We have to ensure now that we are absolutely clear in what rules we are going to set for the independent person to make sure that this is as fair as you say. And I am getting very jaded by all the people who are constantly saying to me and saying to us, as Councillor Townsend said, that this must be able to withstand scrutiny. and be within the law. And as you said, Leader, we've got to ensure we act lawfully. We can't simply ignore legislation we don't like or find inconvenient. Well, you know as well as I do that the Dilly Lane Herts judgment, which the council and other authorities followed from 2008 to the 2018 judgment of the European Court, which overturned it, applies to us and still applies, and we're not complying with that. We are still ignoring the legislation there. The council is knowingly, because they can't answer the question, where's your evidence of the effectiveness of the mitigation? So don't tell me about we've got
Jerry, can you wrap up? Your time's done.
Well, that'll do for now. I'm very unhappy. I would want the executive, please, to ensure that we are able to establish the legal position to a high level of certainty, and certainly not go ahead with what we've got in front of us as being the basis for what an independent person is going to have to stick to, because we won't find someone truly independent and it'll be a sham.
Thank you,
please,
Councillor
executive, whatever you can do about that. Thank you.
Councillor Martin.
Thank you, Leader, and I've listened to this debate with considerable interest. My concern is that this report does seem to narrowly define those who may be able to apply, and my big worry is that the report is not sufficient to enable all of those who are suffering from the effects of SIL in this borough to gain the right decision to rescind or write off their SIL enforcement notices. Having said that, I do welcome the decision that we've heard tonight regarding Steve Daly. That is a terrific response, although I regret that it's taken a long time to get that sorted out. And I do understand that that payment will come from the SIL pot. So that's very interesting. My concern really centres upon recommendation 2.1.5, which deals with the enforcement policy. And we've heard tonight various discussions about it, and it will be separate. My impression is that a large number of those who, from the general nature of the report, won't be able to apply, can apply with the enforcement policy involved. That seems to me needing clarification, because as I understand it, ex gratia payments would be needed, and they can be made. And yet I heard you say, Leader, just a few minutes ago, that the ex gratia policy or ex gratia payments cannot be made because they're not really able to take place with all the other matters to be considered, like best value and being fair and proportionate. I'd like a little clarification on that. I thought we'd got there at that point to say that most people would be able to apply where they have made mistakes and Waverley have not helped them in the process, that they would nevertheless be able to apply and get redress. It sounds to me as if they won't, unless we have an ex gratia payment policy possible. It also seems to me that, of course, it's not unreasonable to take money from the general fund, since the general fund itself has been helped tremendously by the amount of money that's sitting on the balance sheet relevant to SIL and Section 106. And indeed, had the interest from those outstanding balances not been applied to the general fund in the year that we've just seen go by at the end of March, then instead of being £400,000 in surplus, we would have been about £600,000 underwater. And so it seems entirely reasonable to me that payments on ex gratia basis should be made from the general fund, which itself has been bolstered by the interest from SIL sitting on the balance sheet. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Martin. Just to give some clarity on that, it wouldn't be an ex gratia payment, it would be a modification of the enforcement regime, which is why it will be coming back to the now established SIL reform group to look at the enforcement regime. But at the moment, we have a number of applicants potentially to the discretionary review. We don't have confirmed cases and other issues like that yet established. They will, of course, if they exist, will be established by the review, and therefore the enforcement side of this can be redressed. I've got one speaker left, Councillor Ward. There are 4 members here who I did say could speak, but if you do want to speak, I'm going to limit that to 2 minutes because we're nearly at 9 o'clock. And so Councillor Ward, you've got your proper time.
Thank you, Leader. You did say earlier we wouldn't be limited on time.
You are not limited. It'd be the
Thank
others
you.
who didn't register.
Historically, the executive in this administration has always taken notice and acted in conformity with council resolutions. And I, for one, remain confident that in this manner there will not be an exception, and that this report will be modified to be much more inclusive. Hence, I will dispense with further exhortations and just offer some hopefully helpful comments. Let us examine just what the will of council was. In January, they resolved that, quoting, in line with the West Berkshire, householders previously subject to still liability can request a discretionary view by council. It was clear that council wanted all householders who felt they had been disadvantaged by honest mistakes, whether by themselves or by the council, to be able to have their cases reviewed. The January council minutes also show that members expressed a wish that the current draconian enforcement of this be stopped in order to ensure residents were not put under further distress. Disappointingly, this latter does not seem to have happened. There has been much comment about legality and fears that some actions might be unlawful. I would suggest this is presupposition, as a review that only makes recommendations about possible malfunctions of a system cannot be unlawful, and we should await its conclusions. You wanted some comments about the legal opinion. Sadly, the legal opinion we sought was only on the limited application of a single clause. The scope of the power contained in Regulation 65(7) of the Community Infrastructure Regulations 2010 to withdraw a liability notice, not, as would have been much more useful, on how we could help our distressed residents. That opinion did not appear to point out very clearly that by issuing a new liability notice under Section 65(8), we effectively withdrew the previous one. I now come to the report in front of us. Although I admit that in line with does not mean it has to be identical, especially as there seems to be considerable muddle over exactly what West Berks did, this report, by its restrictive nature and the inclusion of certain groups of householders, is in complete opposition to the expressed will of the council. I hope this is a misunderstanding and not intentional. It would have been helpful if officers had referenced the actions taken by West Berks, but some 6 months after our council resolution, there still seems to be widespread confusion over them. A couple of simple phone calls could surely have resolved this, but sadly, it was left to individual councillors to contact West Berks directly to ascertain how they went about things. Whilst the limited scope of our KC's opinion is at variance with those of other King's councils with broader remits, who do not seem to have the same view on the legality of zeroing out liability notices, I do seem that they all agree that the issuing of a liability notice is legally required. However, much flexibility is available to the council in matters of enforcement, in other words, collection of any monies. When considering apparent simple errors made by householders, I believe the review body should have a flexible view on how actions or inactions of the council may have been a contributing factor. For instance, was it clear from the planning permission notices or other communications, e.g. a liability notice sent before development commences, that any exemptions sought had to be applied for in the proper but complicated manner before development commenced? By this I mean, was it made obvious to them, not just by a clause buried in a mass of verbiage? The terms of reference of this review will be critical and should be set up in a much wider manner than this report suggests. I believe today's decision of the executive is an easy one, to enact the will of council and set up an open, full, unrestricted and flexible review. It would also be fair and just if the current apparently draconian enforcement was suspended until the review body reports. These would be the first steps in restoring the councillor's tattered image regarding SIL. The bigger decision on how to react to any recommendations of that review, in particular refunds or ex gratia payments, to help householders who have made minor, innocent paperwork errors, can await its finding and should not be prejudged. But since we are told that there have only been very few applicants, the amounts, whilst momentous to them, are unlikely to be very significant to the council, and I urge a more open review. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Ward. Right, so I've got 4 councillors here who didn't register to speak. Do any of you want 2 minutes? Councillor Hess.
Thank you, Leader. Good evening, members of the executive. Actually, Councillor Ward just referred to a clause which was not in the scope of Simon Bird KC's report to Waverley, which is 65.8. And I have sent an email to the Leader about this because in his report, he cites some of these clauses, including 65.8, and that particular clause says, where a collecting authority issues a new liability notice, any earlier liability notice issued by it for the same chargeable development ceases to have effect. So what I'm asking is, can you advise me and the meeting tonight how this can be implemented for those cases where householders apply for a review, which subsequently finds there were inadvertent errors on the part of the householder or their agent or Waverley Borough Council officers, or if for any reason 65.8 cannot be applied, what the precise reasons are, why not? Many thanks.
So a little bit of that was covered at the start, but there's a paragraph I'm going to say after everybody's spoken that I hope will deal with this quite reasonably. Any others wanting to use 2 minutes? No. Right. So as far as I'm aware so far, both in reading the report and the legal advice and hearing the opinions from officers tonight, we have the discretionary review as documented does do a number of things, and we have all heard that this is the case. Firstly, it deals with the potential where the council has made an error and it has not defined what a council error is in order to ensure the broadest possible scope of application under that determination. And that is where a liability notice can be withdrawn if the council is in error. We've dealt with the fact that other types of error, non-council error, resident or agent error, will be picked up and documented in the discretionary review and will become part of either the enforcement review of the SIL Working Reform Group or indeed lessons learned to prevent those things happening again. The bit that, as far as I'm concerned, has not been resolved in this report, and it's something I heard at ONS, and it's something I've obviously heard from members, and it's something that we have, as an exec, have discussed on a number of occasions with officers, is about whether the overall scope of the report, the ability to access, is too limited. Now, on that basis, I am intending to move an amendment to clause 211. Currently, 211 says approve the implementation of the discretionary householder review in accordance with the process set out in this report at Appendix 3. The report incorrectly says Appendix 1, but it would have been amended to Appendix 3. I'm intending to change that clause, and hopefully we'll have a seconder, to approve the implementation of the discretionary review in accordance with an amended Appendix 3 to remove references to householders and ensure that it considers any errors which have been made by the council in relation to residential applications. That therefore gets rid of the disbarment on self-build. It gets rid of all of the other potential disbarments, but of course does still restrict commercial entities from applying through that process.
Happy to second.
Thank you, Councillor Townsend will be seconding that one. I now bring it to the general debate on the amended discretionary review. One moment. Just to also be clear, a monitoring officer informs me that the request to Simon Bird, the advice to Simon, sorry, the instruction to Simon Bird was to how to implement the will of council. It was not to specifically look at one clause of the legislation, as has been stated a couple of times here. So just moving back to the floor debate on the now amended discretionary
Point of information, that is what he says in the start of his report.
Do you want to comment at all? Do you want to read that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
For the avoidance of doubt, the instructions that went to council were confirming the motion that had been that the full council had adopted, and then setting out the fact that we were very aware that there were two trains of thought in relation to regulation 65(7) and that needed to be addressed, but asking that we were keen that our review had a sound legal basis and the scope and remedies were clearly set out from the outset. Advice was needed to feed into the committee report for the designing of the review. So it was very clear that this advice was being sought in the context of implementing council's motion and recommendation. It was not limited to the scope of 65(7) alone. It was looking at it in the round, but highlighting, because that had been the issue that had been raised in the advice, particularly from that had been shared with us, raising the discrepancy in relation to advice around regulation 65(7). So it was not limited in that way.
Right, I've got one speaker on the now amended motion, Councillor Merriweather.
Thank you, Leader. I want to thank everybody for what mostly was, I think, an informed and an extremely constructive debate, which I've listened to very carefully. I didn't prepare any marks, and I have studiously tried to avoid predetermining myself on this for precisely those reasons. I have received emails, I have received representations directly from residents, and I've listened carefully to the reports relayed by others. And from what I've seen, there are questions to answer, and those people who have been in touch with us deserve a fast and a fair review. And I'm personally thrilled, relieved for Steve that he's got the answer that he sadly had to wait for. But like Councillor Hyman, I'm not a lawyer. I found Simon Bird's advice, however, to be thorough and extremely eloquent, to the point that even I think I understood it. And that has been my keystone in considering all of the things that have been said tonight. I'm thrilled to bits that Councillor Coburn has reassured us that she and ONS are not steering us or advocating in any way that we do anything that's unlawful or illegal, because there has certainly been some confusion in that area. I'm also very happy that what we are proposing will come with compassion and flexibility. And I hope that that message has got through, because I think that's something that seems to have been lacking. And certainly in what I've seen, enforcement is just as important as the liability notice itself. Residents clearly feel that the enforcement process has been too harsh. I do want to pick up on a couple of other of the intended consequences that have been mentioned tonight. I've listened carefully to Councillor Austin. We still, I think, need to see evidence, examples, the evidence for the review. I don't think we can make any decisions at all about compensating anybody, however you want to structure it, without a proper review of the person. I don't think anyone's suggesting we should just write a check without having gone through some sort of a process. And it is the process for me that's a concern, because what I seem to have heard from the opposition seats is that we somehow add another level of process. We slow the process down. We make it more complicated. We expand the scope of it to cover everything imaginable, rather than the very specific cases that we know of that have come to us, and try and demonstrate our good faith, our goodwill to encourage those people who may not be willing to come forward, that it is the right thing to do. I want to pick up on a couple of other specific points. The numbers that have been thrown around in this room and in press releases about the SIL balances and the SIL interest, I'm afraid the maths and the logic just doesn't stack up. Entry level maths tells you that to find an average, you do not use a balance at a particular moment in time and pretend it exists for the whole year. And we operate a balanced budget. As I've said, we have a general fund. And if we want to allocate funds out of that general fund, it is only fair to expect those making those proposals to offer a balancing corresponding funding adjustment, whether it's service cuts, spending cuts, or income increases, wherever they may be, in car parks or whatever it is, to manage it. We have benefited, yes, from interest income, not least because of the inflated interest rates that we've had to live with for the last few years. It is that investment income that has enabled us to carry on delivering services at times of extortionate inflation and keep income and fees and charges increases much lower. One specific point, the SIL regulations that we have that were referred to in the questions, the annual review is specific. The annual review is specific to the allocation of strategic SIL. It says so in the headline to the document, and I'm very sorry if anyone has been misled into thinking otherwise. I just want to talk about unintended consequences because I believe in a fair and a fast review. But I do believe that this whole process, since before January, has brought this council under a level of scrutiny, which makes it more important than ever to avoid criticism, to avoid unfairness, to avoid judicial reviews, to avoid adverse unintended consequences, that we do things transparently, we do them properly, and I want to thank you, Leader, for organising this evening's meeting in a way that I hope everybody feels they've been heard. Thank you.
Thank you. I know this has been a lot for everybody to endure this evening, but there is, I think, a value in making sure we do this wholly and completely here now and leave no threads left undone that doing it this way hopefully will achieve. In the interests of time, I want to make sure that we've got to a vote on this within the next, or ideally by 9:10. I've got 3 speakers left, one of which is Victoria, followed by Tony, and then Liz, if you could speak, but also sum up. So, Victoria.
Thank you, Leader. This is an incredibly complex and emotive topic. I have listened carefully, and I think the language used by some members of our opposition has been disappointing, referring to members of the executive and officers as callous and that the council is deliberately setting traps is, I believe, a grossly unfair accusation to make. I know that as an executive, we have discussed this issue at length, and we all do these roles to try and act in the best interests of our residents. I don't know of any member in this room, opposition or administration, who isn't trying to do the very best for the good of our residents. I would like to therefore acknowledge the hard work of our portfolio holder, Councillor Townsend, the Leader, and to our officers, especially our Assistant Director of Planning, as I know it has been considerable. I am supportive of the change to expand the definition of who can apply, and I'm satisfied that this gives a fair access to the review. I would like to thank all the members who have come this evening and to all of our residents here for coming forward and raising these issues. It's really important that we listen, as I think we are doing so this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Keele. Councillor Fairclough.
Thank you, Leader. I do appreciate and I have absolute sympathy for Annie and all distress suffered by all the Waverley residents. And although I believe that this council is correct in approaching this matter in a necessarily diligent fashion, I also accept that it is an unfortunate consequence that such diligence has taken 6 months to reach the recommendations in front of us here. For clarity, I'd like to state my opinions on the 5 recommendations in front of us. With respect to amended recommendation 211, I believe the amended recommendations addresses all of the concerns, all and any concerns about the scope of the reviews, and I hope that all members of the executive agree with me. Recommendation 212, where we are being asked to note the programme of improvements set out in point 5.6. In my opinion, the 7 suggested improvements are an excellent starting point. In particular, the second one, a review of the SIL enforcement policy. This was referenced by Councillor Ward tonight and is referenced again, of course, in the final recommendation, the 5th one. With respect to the 3rd recommendation, given the political sensitivities of the issue, I believe that it is critical to appoint an independent resource to carry out a full review of each case that comes forward. On the basis that there may be as many as 20 cases, £75,000 seems a reasonable allocation. With the 4th recommendation, and again, given the importance of the issue and the cases, I would like the first report to be considered earlier if possible, ideally 3 months from the start of the review and every 3 months thereafter. That may or may not be possible. With respect to the final recommendation, for me, this is the most important recommendation. I'm aware that members consider the council's SIL enforcement policy to be heavy-handed. It also appears to impose interest charges even if a liability is not enforced. My hope is that the members of the executive working group, and I understand there are there were at least 3 here tonight, do treat this matter as their priority, and knowing those 3 members extremely well, I suspect that they may recommend that the council takes a more lenient, forgiving approach and indeed apply that approach retrospectively. To use a word said many times here tonight, I trust the executive working group to make fair recommendations. However, such recommendations must, as we've all discussed tonight, be within the parameters of the law. Which leaves me with the matter of withdrawing SIL liability notices. Simon Bird's advice is clear. This council is bound by government legislation. However, legislation can be changed, and this council has already begun lobbying to that end. And here I would call upon all affected homeowners, along with their MPs, to do similar. Thank you.
And indeed, we have started that process off with lobbying directly to the Deputy Prime Minister, whose remit this sits within. Councillor Townsend, would you like to sum up before I bring us to a vote on the amended recommendations?
Thank you, Leader. First of all, I'd like to thank everybody here for the time you've taken. You know, it is nearly 9:10, I know that, and we've only gone on one item, so I very much appreciate the amount of consideration that you've given to this topic. This is the first time this executive has had an opportunity to discuss this in public, the discretionary review, so I very much appreciate, you know, your time. I think it's what I would urge anybody is with regard to the discretionary review. I mean, we have talked about it, expanding that to residential, which I have seconded myself, is that people should apply. We have not defined what an error is, and people should apply. They should not be afraid at all. I would urge them to apply. We are committed to righting any wrongs, any errors that have occurred. And that is the best way that we can achieve the outcome, which is the withdrawal of that SIL liability notice. I mean, you know, the West Berkshire scheme, it's not without its flaws. They're relying on the enforcement policy, and that does not withdraw the liability notice. And whether or not, you know, they're having a zero liability, that person still has that on their property. I don't want that for my residents. Wherever possible, I want that withdrawn. So I would, whilst Councillor Austin said it's not fit for purpose, you know, we are working first time on this. We are trying to create a scheme which is fair, that has got compassion, and that will make a real difference to those residents who have found themselves through no fault of their own embroiled in this matter, and then working on the enforcement policy, hopefully that we can look at that as the working group, discuss that in full, and we've agreed as well that those meeting notes will be published, which is unusual for a working group. We've, again, for transparency, we've agreed that those will be published. And you know, I know that at the moment it feels that that policy is draconian. I've seen the text. You know, Mr. Daly sent me the text when he got his civil liability notice. He sent me a copy of that, and I can see how you know, frightening that would be. And obviously, you know, the commitment from us is that we want to make this journey better for all of our residents. I think stating that this council is using funding, SIL funding to raise revenue, it is appalling. I'm shocked. We would never, ever, ever do that. I would never sit on this executive and ever use SIL to raise revenue. Yes, we do get interest, and yes, that interest does go towards services, and that is in line with our financial regulations, and other councils do that as well. Again, you know, Councillor Keele mentioned the words that have been used by the opposition, and to be honest, I'm shocked. Talking about entrapment, talking about coercion, you know, that is not anything that I recognise, and I certainly don't recognise this coming from this executive, and I'm proud of this executive, and I am extremely proud to be a member of this executive, and I know how compassionate, understanding, how dedicated this executive is, and the hours that people put in to making things easier for better for their residents. I know that Jerry talked, you know, he made some rash generalisations. We can't prejudice the outcome of this independent review. This person will be independent. I'm hoping that we may have secured somebody for the role, and they will look at each case individually. We shouldn't prejudice that. It's not our job. We need to see what comes forward and what decisions that they make as well. Again, Councillor Ward mentioned about the enforcement policy, and I hope tonight, as part of the recommendations, that the executive will request that this is a priority for the working group, and that we will look at the enforcement policy as a complete priority. The dates have already gone out. You know, we're discussing dates, and the membership has been established of the working group, which is a cross-party working group. And we're not just talking about some paperwork errors. Some of these cases are very complex and will require an awful lot of work digging back into all of the paperwork. And officers are, you know, absolutely committed to doing that legwork, to present the information, the full information, to the independent person making the decisions. I would just make one comment. In expanding, obviously, the remit of the discretionary review to include residential, I would just highlight that the 75,000 that we have allocated perhaps may not be, it may be sufficient budget, but it may not be. And I would just like to flag that to the executive, that we may need to come forward for a supplementary estimate at some stage. However, I just want to flag that at this stage. I very much support the change, and I very much look forward to this working very quickly and getting this up and running so that we can resolve these matters for our residents. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. And just apologies for doing this, but prompted by a comment that Tony made, I had a quick discussion with the MO regarding clause 214 in terms of the following 6 months review. A quick discussion has been had in the background to check that the head of planning is comfortable with this, but I'm going to propose that it is following 3 months from the start of review, and again at 9 months before that full review at 12 months, because we probably need to know as soon as it's reasonably possible where we are with some of these issues. And I think that's a reasonable change that the officers are able to
Happy to
accommodate.
second, but can I just also clarify that Claire and I speak every day.
Yeah.
And I am keeping total tabs on what is going on this. And Claire would obviously come to me and I would come to you, my fellow exec members, with any issues. In that meantime, we don't need to wait 3 months. I would bring anything forward so that we can make sure that we nip anything in the bud.
I have absolute confidence in that, but it's just a case of having that formal instrument out, just so we're getting an idea of in a public way, what issues we're finding. Because one thing that has been categorized, seen so much during this debate, is a number of particularly members making quite unpleasant statements about the alleged behaviour of the council prior to even a review to establish even the basic facts of that being set up. So I do think it's reasonable that we do an early feedback to everybody, frankly, in public, as to what sort of issues we're finding, that effectively that the review has established itself properly, and that we have an independent person and the process has started and is doing its job. I don't think that's an unreasonable thing, and officers are happy to accommodate. So Liz, you're happy to second that minor amendment?
Happy to second and to confirm the reports will be published as well. Thank you.
Okay, right, in which case I'm now going to move to the amended recommendations. So the amendments at 211 and the amendments at 214, I think, are clear and understood. As far as I'm concerned now, we have addressed the matter of definition of error, i.e. not having one makes it easier for residents to apply. We have addressed the matter of non-council errors and how they'll be dealt with. And we have addressed the matter regarding access to types of homeowner from this. Councillor Ward, did you have a point of order?
Yeah, you said you've addressed the matter of non-council error, but what you have up on the board there limits it to council error.
We are only able to, as part of the discretionary review, remove liability notices. It's been outlined by the head of planning at the beginning of this meeting that the discretionary review, and it is articulated in the actual appendix, would be able to take on board those other non-council errors and bring them forward so that the SIL reform group can deal with them through the enforcement policy. The actual discretionary review itself cannot make resolution to them if it's not a council error, but we are making sure that there is a venue for us to do that as the secondary step. The legal advice was quite clear what we can and can't do in terms of liability notices. Right, I'm now bringing it to the vote on the amended resolutions. Councillor Keele, apologies.
Could I just ask some clarity on the amended recommendation 2.14? Was it intentional to remove the reference to 6 months?
Yeah, so 3 and 9. Yeah, so that we get an early sight of it and then it can carry on its work. I think really what I'm seeking here is confirmation that it's been established and is functioning as intended, so that if we needed to make any other intervention, we'd have an early sight of that. As Liz says, I'm sure we would hear anyway, but I think it needs to be done in a public way. I would imagine if we aren't comfortable with that, we can ask for it to be 6 anyway, but at least this way we can kick it off, get sight of it, and it can do its work for 6 more months before finally reporting. Right, can I have all those in favour of the now amended recommendations for a SIL discretionary review? That is unanimous. Thank you all. I'm now calling a 5-minute adjournment for the rest of the exec. Everybody else obviously do what you need to do. I'm going to get some more water and take 5, but we then need to come back and do this. We need to do grounds maintenance with some speed whilst being reasonable, and then some other items too. So please be back in 5 minutes. We are now resuming for several reasons, considering the time. I'm opting to defer the grounds maintenance to the adjourned session, which will be at Monday at 10:30, particularly as literally everybody who'd registered to speak on the subject seems to have not come back after the SIL item, even though I said 5 minutes. So I won't be a pain and do it anyway, which I could right now. I'll wait because that's the right and naturally just thing to do. So we'll move on then to, let me just actually make sure I get the right agenda item number. We'll move on to item 13, shared people and OD services between Waverley and Guildford. The report here is fairly self-explanatory, and effectively this starts the shared service of people and organisational development. This particularly supports the acceptance of the delegation by Guildford to Waverley of its people and organisational development functions. There is cost savings that will be generated by this and significant efficiency savings. And I want to thank all the officers who have worked to bring this forward. I think it aligns with our collaboration aims. It certainly makes the HR and OD functions more resilient to the changes that we've got. And particularly want to thank Claire W for all the work that she's done to get it to this stage. Are there any other speakers on this item? Yeah. Victoria.
Thank you, Leader. I'm happy to second this proposal. It will enable our people and OD functions to improve their performance and enhance our resilience and capacity. These services are an incredibly important function to our council and to Guildford Borough Council. The proposal will enable opportunities to combine our systems and give a consistent approach, which will enable us to be as ready as we can be for the challenges of local government reorganisation. I would also like to thank our new AD, Claire Weavis, for the leadership she has shown on these issues. Thank you.
We have a minor amendment that needs to be moved, which is now on the screen. It is mostly just to align dates and other issues that have been superseded by the Guildford report being updated. We have to do it as a formal amendment because our report had been formally published at the time that was required. Victoria.
Happy to second the amendment.
Thank you. In which case, are there any other speakers on this item in general? Otherwise, I'll move to the recommendations. Can I have all those in favour of the recommendations, please show? The amended recommendation, I should say. And that is carried. Moving then on to, when I can find the right one. 16, the approval of the extension to staffing. So we have previously authorised temporary arrangements as set out in Appendix A until the 31st of December 2025. Those very sensible arrangements require an extension, and this motion enacts that extension. Any speakers? Victoria.
Also happy to second this proposal. It makes sense to enable our chief executive, who is our head of paid service, to hire the staff that are needed in consultation with the leaders. This will give us consistency in the sharing of staff with Guildford Borough Council and maintaining our service delivery. Thank you.
Can I have all those in favour of recommendations 3.1 to 3.4? Thank you very much indeed. As we have still got some time, I'm going to do item 17, the procurement of new pay and display machines, which sets with Tony.
No, it sets with...
Oh, sorry, it sets with Mark. My apologies. I always make that up, miss that up.
If he was. Report, page 381 of your packs, Leader. So it's no secret that the pay and display machines, payment machines in our car parks are overdue for replacement, to put it mildly. And the report describes just some of the details which we're all familiar with from our own experience. The replacement of the machines was flagged in our 2025-26 budget, and I'm pleased to report that the joint procurement process we've been through with Guildford has delivered for us a recommendation which is even better value for money than we'd hoped. On the value side, our residents and other users get all of the technological upgrades and benefits of future proofing and flexibility that are described in the report within the constraints that the government prescribes for us. And on the money side, we spend £89,700 of one-off capital cost, which is less than half of the amount provided in our 25-26 capital programme. And in return for that, we get an annual recurring revenue cost of £22,770, which will save at least £172,300 over the 10-year life of the contract compared to our current budgeted expenditure. So I'm delighted to commend the recommendation to the exec. Thank you.
And formally for the record, I am pleased to second. Any other speakers on this item? Tony, yeah.
I just want to clarify something on point 6.1, just in case there is any potential for confusion. Where we talk about the cost of around 75,000 to service, that is just to service the existing machines. Obviously, as a council, we spend a far greater sum of money upgrading, maintaining our car parks. Indeed, those, Mark and Kika's not here, those of us in Farnham will be seeing the lower Hart car park being repaired very, very soon. So that cost of 75,000 is only about servicing the machines you see.
Any other speakers on this? In which case I'll move to the recommendation. So there's one recommendation. Can I have all those in favour, please show? Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to take exactly 2 further items before adjourning the session. The first one is the air quality report. Guess which one the last one will be?
Okay, thank you. I'll try and be very brief. It's been a long meeting, but it is important that this is a report that requires our attention because it is a statutory requirement under the Environment Act to take this to our executive, and it's part of our obligations under the local air quality management framework. So we have to submit our annual status report and any required air quality action plan updates to DEFRA. That's legally mandated. So I'm not going to spend a long time in this already distended, we might say, meeting in going through the detail of this report. You've got it in your papers, but I just draw your attention to paragraph 7.15 in the report, which highlights current priorities. I don't think there is much here with which we can disagree, but specifically one thing that merits further consideration beyond today is that in our designated air quality monitoring areas, the AQMAs in Godalming and Farnham, where the nitrogen dioxide concentrations have not exceeded statutory limits for several years, it may be timely for us to consider applying to DEFRA for the de-designation of these AQMAs. And should we proceed with that, the legal requirement for a specific local action plan would lapse, but that would allow us to reallocate resources more strategically, including for the more strategically important broader initiatives outlined in our recently adopted clean air strategy. So in summary, in order to meet statutory requirements, I would urge support for the recommendations, and we can then move forward for further discussion about the status of our AQMAs and the appropriateness of our 2 existing AQMAs.
Thank you, Steve. I have one registered speaker who is still with us, Councillor Hyman, if you are still with us indeed.
So, present, if not in mind. Would be very worried. Thank you very much, Leader. Very worried about the idea of taking on de-designation at this point. We are some years away from knowing the full impact of the Farnham infrastructure project. And I think, as I've said many times in the past, just a very brief reminder that Surrey County Council claimed to have modelled in a detailed parametric modelling the impacts of the Farnham infrastructure project, but it showed people in fact a different sort of modelling to the Farnham board in June 2023, and have basically refused to show us the modelling. Perhaps they couldn't model it because the results were so bad. And our air quality action plan states in there from 2023, the last time we consulted and put together the action plan, states within it specifically that we need the modelling. We need the traffic modelling to be able to model the air quality. So the idea of going forward and getting rid of the protection that our residents have from council mistakes, whether they be ours or the or Surrey County Councils or anybody else's. We've got a lot of development in surrounding areas, and the idea that air quality is only going to go downwards and improve. Obviously, it went down for COVID, but in COVID, we some of the Surrey County Council's deliberate congestion measures were put in place and left in place, like in Downing Street in Farnham. We've got a difficulty with how we measure the air quality. In as much as we know we have bias corrections, we should have distance corrections as well, because our assumption at Waverley is that the receptors are houses, not people, or the people that are in residential properties. I remember back, getting on for a decade ago, when we were pipped by the A331 up at Frimley for funding for measures on air quality, but of course the receptors up there were the people sat in cars. There aren't any houses up at the Frimley interchange at the end of the A331 where the problem was worse than Farnham. And so, we need to be looking at, well, in Downing Street, the receptors.
30 seconds left, Jerry.
Okay, really, we need modelling. That's the most important thing, is for us to be able to model this. And I hope therefore pick up on the fact that that we haven't done that, and we should not be going forward and making any important changes or de-designation until we know the outcomes of what's being done and whether it really is going to improve air quality by causing more congestion. Thank you.
Thanks, Jerry. And just to be clear, we're definitely not actually doing any decision making on de-designation. I share the view of a number of people in Farnham that the Farnham infrastructure plan might modify where the zone would be and would need to be remodelled properly to determine that anyway. And also share your concerns that the original modelling was somewhat, what's the word, totally absent.
So, thank you, Leader.
Yeah, Steve.
Yeah, I mean, I think we need a separate conversation about the whole issue of de-designation. The point is, the real question is, what is the best possible deployment of our resources and our staff as a council in order to improve air quality? I think, Jerry, you make a very valid point in relation to receptors. I mean, one of the concerns that I have is that statutory requirements do not require us to monitor the air quality at schools at child level. And that is something which I'm certainly very keen for us to pursue, particularly. That is where the impact of poor air quality can be most deleterious, most damaging to our children and young people. So, there's a lot more debate on this that we need to have. I'm very happy to have that debate. My concern is that we fulfill our statutory requirement today and we go forward and actually deploy our resource in terms of air quality monitoring in the best possible way. And I take very much the point about the Farnham infrastructure plan, and we need to move carefully and cautiously on that basis.
And on that note, I'd like to move the recommendation that the executive receives the draft ASR 2025 report. And we've obviously not had to make any particular comments that would cause any amendments to it, so it can be sent off. All those in favour of the recommendation, please show. Thank you. And now, what meeting where we haven't discussed for 2 hours still could it be possible to end on a high note? I think we're going to end with the Brightwells item to note. So Tony, and then I will adjourn the session, I promise.
Thank you, Paul. Oh, how the mighty have fallen. Once upon a time, Brightwells would have been the hottest ticket in town, but tonight, as we can see, nobody wants to know. So I will keep this brief. First of all, and probably most important of all, I'd like to praise and thank the Waverley officers who've worked tirelessly to get us to this position where the executive even has a recommendation to consider. And in particular, I'd like to pay credit to Debbie Smith, Mark Davis, Kelvin Mills, and Claire Beasley alongside. So thank you very much for all your efforts. I'd also like to thank Councillor Natalie Bramall, my opposite number at Surrey County Council. Her involvement actually has been invaluable over the last 2 months. I will return to the recommendation after a couple of housekeeping points, one of which slightly changes things. With respect to point 4.1, the relining of the car park will require it to be closed, and our worst case scenario estimates that this may take up to 4 weeks. Now, that isn't just people painting lines on the car park. It will actually also require some sort of construction elements as well. Now, we've very recently, I think last week, been advised that Surrey are now planning what they call a major promotional event in August. And as a result, they've told us that they don't want the car park to be closed between August the 11th and August the 31st. Since Crest are understandably currently able to confirm when the relining / construction work will start, obviously, in order to meet the August the 11th deadline, it would have to start by the 14th of July. I suspect it won't start by the 14th of July. Therefore, it's entirely possible, in fact, it's probably probable that Waverley will not take over the car park until October 25. And obviously this timeline will have an effect on point 6.9 of the report. I'd also like to very quickly draw your attention to point 6.4 through 6.6. And the resolution of the matters stated within is testament again to the professionalism of our officers and our appointed consultants Stripe singular, sorry. And it should also be noticed the involvement of our officers played a critical part in mitigating the risks you see identified in point 10.2. I'd also like to draw your attention to point 12.1.1. It is absolutely critical that this council looks for ways to reduce the service charges, not just in relation to our costs of running the car parks itself, although that is a major consideration, but we're also aware that the service charges for the whole retail development are frequently cited by businesses as a negative. And here, our officers, in particular planning enforcement, are going to have to do a lot of work on that, and I thank them in advance. And finally, you'll be glad to know, with respect to 12.2, the anticipated income from the car park is £210,000 per annum. And that revenue, if you like, is what I would term new revenue. Currently, Surrey County Council have chosen to operate the car park free of charge. The revenue that we will need, not least to pay for the service charges I just mentioned, is likely to come from shoppers and users of the cinema and restaurants. Now, our observation is that whilst attractive, understandably, the free parking offer that's currently implemented by Surrey is actually only benefiting workers and indeed, increasingly, we are told, commuters who are choosing to park for free in Brightwells car park and walk up to Farnham Station. And indeed, we have sort of opinions from Farnham Station that their revenue is down. So what I would say is recognizing that obviously workers are key to the economy of Farnham, that when we do take over the car park and almost certainly introduce charges, we will be, and in fact, we already are working with the bid to devise discounted offers for workers to park in our longer stay car parks, in particular Riverside 1, 2 and 3 and St James. So we are aware that there is potentially an issue coming up, and Mark Davis and I are already working to resolve it. So with that in mind, I'd like to move the resolution.
I think it's been seconded. I just want to be clear, we've got a seconder. If not, it's me. I think Mark proposed it. I've seconded it. There we go. or somebody. It's fine. We've resolved it. We've resolved it. This is why we aren't doing grounds maintenance right now. So we have one recommendation before you. Are there any further speakers on this matter? So the resolution is to, sorry, Mark, apologies.
Sorry, Leader, at the one of the recent meetings that we held for local plan, I was speaking with a business owner in Farnham from the south end of Downing Street, who asked us to please consider a window, a 4-hour parking window. So in some places we go from 3 to 5 up to whatever it is. Apparently in the leisure industry, which I'm not an expert in, 4-hour working slots are quite common, 4-hour working shifts. And when we do that for workers, particularly in Farnham, can we bear in mind that a 5-hour slot may be too much because we'll be asking people to pay for an extra hour. So I just wanted to register that. Thanks.
Just for clarity, Mark, are you talking about a 4-hour season ticket or a 4-hour? Because we have 4-hour tickets.
Apparently in some of the car parks, and I don't know which ones, it was a business owner who caught me frankly unprepared.
Okay.
Who said that we do have, in some cases, our machines to up to 3 hours and then up to 5 hours. If that's incorrect, I'll be very happy to go back and correct it.
No, I am aware that there is a slight issue with, but that is being looked at, but it's not as you describe. But we're on top of it anyway.
Okay, can I bring us back to the recommendation then? All those in favour of the recommendation, please show. And with that, all the remaining business is adjourned till 10:30 on Monday morning, where we will deal with grounds maintenance as the first item on the agenda. I will send an email to all those to all members, particularly those who registered to speak, to tell them that we've moved it. And if I get any pushback, I'll remind them that they all left when they thought that the item was going to be heard. So at that point, 21:48, meeting adjourned.